And what have kings that privates have not too? Save ceremony, save general ceremony. And what art thou, thou idle ceremony? I am a king that find thee, and I know 'tis not the balm, the scepter and the ball, the sword, the mace, the crown imperial, the intertissued robe of gold and pearl, the facet title running for the king, the throne he sits on, nor the tide of pomp that beats upon the high shore of this world. Not all these, laid in bed majestical, can sleep more soundly than the wretched slave.
In the course of our account of the reigns of the kings and queens, we will attempt to look behind the ceremonial image of the monarch at the individuals whose behavior and personalities had such influence on the history of England and Great Britain. From the dim centuries of the Dark Ages, which commenced in the 5th century, through to the last Tudor monarch to rule these isles in 1603, England has seen 4 major branches of the story of her kings and queens. Firstly, there were the Anglo-Saxon and Viking kings, who ruled from the 5th century until 1066 AD. They were followed by the Norman kings, who held sway from 1066 to 1154. In turn, the Normans were followed by the Plantagenets, who endured from 1485 until the death of the childless Elizabeth I in 1603. Thereafter, the line of succession to the throne took a new twist with the arrival of the Scots dynasty, the House of Stuart. But that is altogether a different story. We are concerned here with kings and queens from the Dark Ages to Elizabeth I, and we begin with the Saxon kings of the Dark Ages. Our knowledge of these leaders is lodged in the no man's land between myth and fact. We know that in the 6th century, the Britons united under a great chieftain named King Arthur, who is supposed to have held court at his famous Round Table in Camelot. He was successful in driving the Saxons out of what is today the South Midlands. His achievement was only temporary. By the year 600, much of the country was back under the rule of the Anglo-Saxons. This map shows the kingdoms of England as they were in the 8th century. Each had its own individual leader, but its most dominant was given the title Bretwalder, ruler of Britain, a position of prestige, but with no formal power. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us, "The first to rule so great a kingdom was Aile, king of Sussex. The second was Cowlin, king of Wessex. The third was Ethelbert, king of Kent. The fourth was Raedwald, king of East Anglia. The fifth was Edwin, king of Northumbria. The sixth was Oswald, who reigned after him. The seventh was Oswiu, Oswald's brother. The eighth was Egbert, king of Wessex." Egbert's grandson was a figure whose exploits had become fabled. His name was Alfred the Great. In 878, Alfred suffered a defeat at the hands of the Vikings and was forced to retreat to his stronghold at Apelem. During his flight, a woman was reputed to have given him shelter, and he repaid this kindness by falling asleep and allowing her cakes to burn. Nowadays, he is as famous for this escapade as for the fact that he was the only English leader who took a significant stand against the invading Danes, whom he eventually defeated at the Battle of Edington. By the terms of the Peace of Wedmore, Guthrum, the Dane, agreed to withdraw from Essex and a large part of Mercia. In the peace that followed, Alfred was able to undertake a codification of the law to extend and strengthen the shire system of local government, and to improve the administration of his financial and judicial affairs. He was a patron of the arts and did much to encourage the writing of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, from which so much of our knowledge of these early times derives. Alfred's heirs, Edward the Elder, Ethelstan, Edgar, and Edward the Martyr, continued to repel invaders, but his great-great-great-grandson Ethelred, known as the Unready, lost his throne to King Sweyn of Denmark. Ethelred's son, Edward the Confessor, eventually reclaimed it, but he was to prove no match for the Normans.
It is in the Anglo-Saxon period that you see the development of a church in England, a church which survives right the way through. The development of a governmental system which made England the most advanced state in Western Europe by 1066. And you've also got to remember that despite the fact that the Normans come along speaking Norman French, not speaking English, that ultimately the language of this country will be English rather than Anglo-Norman, Latin, or even a Celtic language. You can see the depth of debt that this country has to the Anglo-Saxons and their influence. And you can therefore see that although in lots of respects this is a dark age, that it's not easy to interpret, the evidence is fragmentary and so on, that a dark age doesn't actually mean that we're dealing with something which is insignificant.
As well as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the visual source of information about the downfall of the Saxons is the Bayeux Tapestry. Made in 1080 and 231 feet long, this wonderful piece of work consists of 72 tableaux, which show how Harold, Earl of Wessex, was shipwrecked off the coast of Normandy. To gain his freedom, he was obliged to swear an oath confirming William, the Duke of Normandy, as the successor to the English king, Edward the Confessor. After Edward's death, Harold himself was elected by the ruling council, the Witan, and crowned king. In October 1066, William of Normandy landed at Hastings to claim what he believed was rightfully his. The tapestry shows Harold being shot by an arrow in the eye, paving the way for the Norman dynasty to rule in England for a period of 88 years, from 1066 until 1154. William I, known as the Conqueror, was thus crowned the first Norman king. He commissioned a survey of his new realm, known as the Doomsday Book, in order that he would know exactly what taxes were due to him. He became extremely unpopular, and the hostility felt by the English serfs to their Norman lords increased during the reign of his son, William II, who became king in 1087. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us he was very harsh and fierce in his rule over his realm and towards his followers and to all his neighbors, and very terrifying. He was continually exasperating his nation with depredations and unjust taxes. Everything that was hateful to God and to righteous men was the daily practice to this land during his reign. Therefore, he was hated by almost all his people. Another fatal arrow hit its mark. In 1100, William II was killed while out hunting. Although whether this was an accident or an act of assassination, no one is really sure. He was succeeded by Henry I, known as Beauclerk because of his scholarly nature. Henry died after a bout of overeating. His heir, William, having drowned at sea in 1128, his daughter Matilda claimed the throne. In 1135, it would have been inconceivable for a woman to be queen, and her cousin Stephen was crowned instead. There followed a period of civil war, during which the followers of each fought for supremacy. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I know not how to, nor am I able to tell of all the atrocities, nor all the cruelties which they wrought upon the unhappy people of this country. And so it lasted for 19 years, while Stephen was king, till the land was all undone and darkened with such deeds, and men said openly that Christ and his angels slept. Stephen and Matilda resolved their differences with a compromise. After Stephen's death in 1154, her son Henry became king, and a new era was ushered in. In the 17th century, to celebrate the restoration of Charles II, Sir Richard Baker wrote a book called The Chronicles of the Kings of England from the time of the Roman government to the reign of King Charles II, and he paints us a picture of Henry II, the first Plantagenet king who ruled from 1154 until 1189.
He was somewhat red of face and broad-breasted, short of body, and therewithal fat, which made him use much exercise and little meat. He was rather superstitious than not religious, while he showed more by his carriage towards Becket being dead than while he lived.
Despite the fact that he managed to curb the powers of his ambitious barons while pursuing a successful military career, Henry is most remembered for his treatment of Thomas à Becket. When the office of Archbishop of Canterbury fell vacant, the king appointed his friend à Becket, looking for his unconditional support. Contrary to his expectations, the new archbishop made it clear that his allegiance was now to the Pope in Rome. In a fit of rage, the king cried out, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" And 4 knights of his court, taking him at his word, rode to Canterbury and slaughtered Thomas in the cathedral. King Henry did public penance for the murder of his friend, who was later canonized. During his reign, he implemented many legal reforms, dividing the country into 6 circuits, over each of which he appointed 3 judges. The tradition of common law in England is said to date from Henry's reign. Richard the Lionheart succeeded his father, Henry II, in 1189, having made his last years a misery by plotting against him. His chief preoccupation was fighting Saladin, and he set out for the Holy Land to join the Third Crusade, where his greatest feat was the capture of the town of Acre. During the 10 years that he was king, Richard spent only 6 months in England. Sir Richard Baker describes him thus.
He was tall of stature and well proportioned, fair and comely of face, of hair, bright auburn, of long arms, and nimble in all his joints. To speak of his moral parts, his vices were, for the most part, but only upon suspicion. Incontinency in him much spoken of, nothing proved. But his virtues were apparent, for in all his actions he showed himself valiant, from whence the appellation or surname of Coeur de Lion, wise, liberal, merciful, just, and which is most of all, religious, a prince born for the good of Christendom.
While Richard was away in the east, his brother John ruled in his place. During this time, and from 1199, when he came to the throne in his own right, he became disliked for the abuses that he perpetrated. He argued with the Pope, Innocent III, over whose right it was to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury, and as a result, the Pope placed England under an interdict which prohibited all the principal religious ceremonies except baptism and extreme unction. John employed foreign mercenaries to enforce his unpopular laws, eventually obliging his barons to draw up a document outlining basic civil rights. The king was forced to sign the Magna Carta. Parliament, as we know it today, has its roots in the reign of Henry III, who was king from 1216 until 1272. Unable to learn from the poor examples set by his father John, Henry continued to abuse and exploit his position. His contempt among the barons reached such a pitch that, led by Simon de Montfort, they defeated and captured the king at Lewes in 1264. The following year, Henry agreed that representatives of all the shires and boroughs in the land should be summoned to a grand council or parliament. Originally intended as a check to royal excesses, over the centuries, this institution has evolved into the system of government which we know today. Edward I was Henry's son and reigned from 1272 until 1307. Unlike his father, he was a force to be reckoned with. He achieved much by way of unifying Britain. In 1283, he completed the conquest of Wales, and to pacify his new Welsh subjects, he presented his infant heir to them to be their prince. The title that Prince Charles holds now derives from this time. Since 1284, the eldest son of the monarch has been known as the Prince of Wales. Edward I made many attempts to conquer Scotland. He became known as the Hammer of the Scots, but he was unable to subjugate his neighbors, who were successfully led by Robert the Bruce. Edward died at Bone-on-Sands in the Solway Firth during an expedition against the Scots in 1307, and was succeeded by his son Edward II, an altogether weaker character.
Edward I was indeed a very hard man to follow. He was a tough, no-nonsense soldier and a brilliant monarch at the same time.
The second Edward had homosexual tendencies, and his fondness for his favorite, Piers Garriston, drove his wife Isabella into the arms of his enemy, the Earl of Mortimer. The Queen and Mortimer blackmailed Edward into abdicating and imprisoned him in Berkeley Castle.
Edward II has really received a very bad press, both in his own time and subsequently. And this is not, in fact, entirely fair. Although we must admit he had his favourites, Piers Gaveston and others, and people who questioned his sexual mores, at the same time he was an extremely cultivated king, enjoying art and music and painting. In many ways he was way ahead of his time. But the trouble was he was not really tough enough to be a king in this particular century. And he was not able to subordinate his own personal interest to his duties as king. As Napoleon said, it was not the Roman army that crossed the Rubicon, it was Caesar. In war, it is not men that matter, it is the man. The English army had not got a proper commander.
Edward III succeeded to his father's throne on his death in 1327. He built Windsor Castle, and at a ball held there, it is said, he picked up a lady's garter with the words, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," evil be to him who thinks evil, thus instituting the Order of the Garter, which is now the highest honor in the land. He laid claim to the throne of France through his mother, Isabella, and under his command, the 100 Years' War began. He defeated France at 3 battles, the most famous of which is the Battle of Crécy. His son, the Black Prince, captured the French king at Poitiers, and in 1360, the Treaty of Brittany brought a temporary end to hostilities. Edward surrendered his claim to the throne in return for Calais, Aquitaine, and Gascony.
But finally, the thing that most grieved him was the loss of that most noble gentleman, his dear son, Prince Edward, in whom was found all parts that might be wished in a worthy governor. The consideration of the world's mutability, which he tried to the full, caused him, as is thought, to have in mind the life in the world to come, and therefore, of a pure devotion, founded the Church and College of St. Stephen at Westminster, and another at Cambridge, called King's Hall.
With the death of the Black Prince, Edward was succeeded by his grandson, Richard. As with his great-grandfather, Edward II, Richard singled out favorites among his courtiers, causing discontent in those who were not of the chosen few. In 1388, the malcontents banded together and executed many of the king's closest friends. Richard maintained his authority and banished the rebels, including his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. The following year, Bolingbroke returned from abroad, challenged the weakened king, and usurped the crown. He reigned as Henry IV from 1399 to 1413, and was plagued with rebellion, both in Wales under Owen Glendower and in Scotland under the Douglas. Shakespeare has him remark, "Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown." The 100 Years' War was still raging against France. Having been a dissolute Prince of Wales, Henry V, who came to the throne on the death of his father in 1413, proved to be a magnificent leader and king, inspiring his army to a heroic victory on the fields of Agincourt. Again, we look to Shakespeare to set the scene for us.
Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace there nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger.
Henry VI came to the throne in his infancy, and as a weak king provided ample opportunity for factions to rise up against him. The Wars of the Roses were fought between the descendants of Edward III. The Lancastrians were descended from his son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and the Yorkists from his youngest son, Edmund, Duke of York. The red rose was the emblem of the Lancastrians, and the white rose stood for York. Richard, Duke of York, was made protector of the land when Henry VI had a temporary bout of insanity in 1453. On his recovery 2 years later, the king resumed power, and the Yorkists then rose up in rebellion. They captured Henry, and Richard, Duke of York, was made protector once more. When the king again recovered his reason, the fighting resumed, and this time the Yorkists were put to flight. In 1460, they returned to England from abroad under the leadership of the Duke of York's son, Edward. Having captured King Henry after the Battle of Towden, Edward became king in 1461. 9 years later, Henry was brought back out of retirement by a former Yorkist, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. Henry ruled from 1470 until 1471, when Edward IV snatched the throne from him a second time and held it till his death in 1483. But a picture of a young Edward V is left to us in the words of Dominicus Mancinus, who wrote in this contemporary account,
"He and his brothers were withdrawn into the inner apartments of the tower proper, and day by day began to be seen more rarely behind the bars and windows, till at length they ceased to appear altogether. Dr. Argentine, the last of his attendants whose services the king enjoyed, reported that the young king, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, believing his death to be near at hand. I must not stay silent as touching on the gifts of the youth. He had such dignity in his whole person, and in his face such charm, that however much they might gaze, they never wearied the eyes of the beholders. I have seen many men burst forth into tears and lamentations when mention was made of him after his removal from men's sight, and already there was a suspicion that he had been murdered. Whether, however, he has been murdered, and by what manner of death, so far I have not at all discovered."
The mystery of the death of Edward V, which Mancinus refers to, has never been solved, although subsequently the skeletons of 2 youths were discovered buried at the bottom of a flight of stairs in the Tower of London. It is generally accepted that the young king and his brother were unlawfully killed, although opinions remain divided as to who was the culprit. A likely suspect was Richard of Gloucester, brother to Edward IV and the uncle of Edward V. He was made protector during the latter's brief reign as the young king had not yet reached his majority. When Parliament passed an act in 1483 declaring Edward V and his brother illegitimate on account of their father's existing betrothal to another woman when he married their mother, Richard became king. The Lancastrian cause was not yet dead. It had found a new leader in Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, another descendant of John of Gaunt. He returned from exile abroad and joined in battle against Richard III on the field of Bosworth in 1485.
This battle was, in fact, quite a small one, as battles go, even inside the Wars of the Roses. There were 12,000 men on the side of Richard III, and only 10,000 men, at least at the beginning of the battle, on the side of Henry Tudor. The formations the armies took up were not particularly elaborate. Both sides had got a forward line of billmen and bowmen in a long, thin formation. And behind them, you had, in the case of the Richard III, his great mounted body of knights, the remainder of those who were still part of his party and supporting him. On the side of Tudor, you have got the infantry as well as some cavalry, but he had more infantrymen on the field rather than mounted knights. And this battle is pretty scrappy. It is not particularly dramatic. Of course, we all think of Shakespeare, of course, and his famous way of developing this battle. Mustn't forget, of course, that Shakespeare was very much a Tudor propagandist, and his view of Richard III and so forth was not exactly, shall we say, balanced. Never mind. You have his famous phrase of having Richard rushing around saying, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, after he'd been dismounted. In terms of casualties, it is thought something like 1,000 of the Richard III's party actually killed on the battlefield, and possibly 900 of the party of Henry Tudor.
Although the king fought valiantly and proved to be the last English monarch to die in battle, he was defeated, and his crown was found caught in a bush and given to Henry, Earl of Richmond. The ill reports of Richard III, including the suggestion that he murdered his nephews, all date from the reign of the usurping king Henry VII, who was the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Perhaps Henry VII's greatest achievement when he seized the throne in 1485 was to unite the houses of York and Lancaster, and thus end the civil war which had simmered throughout the 15th century. A Lancastrian himself, he made Edward V's sister, Elizabeth of York, his queen.
It was the end of the great feudal period. At Oxford University, paper 2, The Middle Ages, comes to an end in 1485. It does not greatly bemoaned. Let us face it, this had been a period of great rival alliances, rival royal houses, huge wars won and lost in France, terrible wars in England in terms of, like the Wars of the Roses, or far earlier, those of Stephen and Matilda. In many ways, it is not to be regretted, the end of the feudal period. Now we have a monarchy which is efficient, which is going to really run the country, and certainly, in my opinion, not before time.
Henry VIII became king on his father's death in 1509. He was very much a Renaissance figure, a man of diverse talents. The Venetian ambassador to his court reported that he speaks French, English, and a little Italian, plays well on the lute and harpsichord, sings from the book at sight, draws the bow with greater strength than any man in England, and jousts marvelously. Believe me, he is in every respect a most accomplished prince. The memory of the Wars of the Roses was still fresh in people's minds, and Henry knew the vital importance of producing a male heir to ensure the succession and prevent the recurrence of civil war. Catherine of Aragon bore him a daughter, Mary, but when it became plain she would not be able to give him a son, he saw no option but to divorce her. Since divorce was forbidden within the Catholic Church, the king took the radical step of breaking with Rome and establishing the Church of England, over which he had absolute authority. He enriched his coffers by ordering the dissolution of the monasteries and allowed the new religion, which was sweeping through the Europe of the Reformation, to take hold of his country. and he divorced his wife without further ado. On her deathbed, Catherine wrote most movingly to him.
My lord and dear husband, I commend me unto you. The hour of my death draweth fast on, and my case being such, the tender love I owe you forceth me with a few words to put you in remembrance of the health and safeguard of your soul, which you ought to prefer before all worldly matters, and before the care and tendering of your body, for which you have cast me into many miseries, and yourself into many cares. For my part, I do pardon you all. Yea, I do wish and devoutly pray God that he will also pardon you. For the rest, I commend you unto Mary our daughter, beseeching you to be a good father unto her, as I heretofore desired. Lastly, I do vow that mine eyes desire you above all things.
By this time, Henry was caught up with wooing Anne Boleyn, who he married as soon as he was free to do so. He ends one of his letters to her, wishing myself especially an evening in my sweetheart's arms, whose pretty duckies I trust shortly to kiss. Written with the hand of him that was, is, and shall be yours by his own will. Their union lasted 3 years, and yielded only another daughter, Elizabeth. Dissatisfied, Henry sought a way out of his second marriage. Anne was charged with adultery, and wrote to her husband from the Tower of London to plead for her life. In spite of her pleas, Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536. Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, was able to give him a boy, but she never recovered from Prince Edward's birth, and shortly afterwards, in 1537, she died. The king was filled with revulsion on seeing his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, who was a political choice, advised by his chief administrator, Thomas Cromwell. The marriage was never consummated, and it was said that the couple spent their wedding night playing cards. Another divorce followed, and Cromwell, who had instigated the match, was beheaded. The charms of Catherine Howard, the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, who the king married next, were potent, but they proved to be short-lived. Like Anne Boleyn, she was executed on charges of adultery, leaving Catherine Parr to become the last of the king's consorts.
Essentially, Catherine Howard was just a young girl. She was roughly 21 when she married Henry, and he was 48 at that time, probably as old as her parents. She had the outlook of a young girl, she had the interests of a young girl. There is a story that Henry bored her. I don't know if that's true or not, it might be apocryphal. But certainly she had her eye open for the young men about her and was very easily distracted by any young man that showed her any interest whatsoever. It's certainly true that she was indiscreet in her earlier years, and by here we're talking about 18 or 19, and there is at least a suspicion that she had had sex with one of her suitors earlier on. After she became queen, unfortunately for her, she continued to have liaisons with other young men. Notably, Culpeper is one of the characters that came in. And she died on the block, I think, accused of illegal intercourse. Because, of course, to have liaisons with the Queen of England was high treason. And in a sense, she committed high treason herself by having those relations.
By the end of the reign of Henry VIII in 1547, religious life in England had changed beyond all recognition. Catholicism had been done away with, and the fine abbeys and monasteries in which this faith had flourished were all dissolved, and Protestantism had become the official doctrine of the land.
I don't believe that Henry was that committed to the future of the country as a whole, whereas these ministers certainly were. So the good that did come out of Henry's reign, I think, really can be attributed to other people. The fact that this is a Protestant country is almost accidental in terms of Henry's reign. I mean, it's often said that Henry established a Protestant church in this country. He didn't. He established the Church of England with himself at the head, and I think that was a form of vanity, but also it enabled him to pursue his own interests again. The fact that ultimately this became a Protestant church was very much despite Henry. Later on in his reign, he actively pursued Protestant heretics and still saw himself as a Catholic. So I'd say all of the things that have been attributed to Henry really have been attributed unfairly. I don't think, as a man, Henry himself contributed anything at all. I think it was the people around him that contributed to the good of the country. And it's the people around him who, as it were, engineered the path that the future was going to take. And as I say again, particularly Wolsey and Cromwell.
Henry was succeeded by the sickly son who Jane Seymour bore to him. Some have suggested that he might have suffered from syphilis, inherited from his father. Edward VI was eager to continue the work of the Reformation of the Church that his father had begun. After his death at the age of 16, Northumberland, the Lord Protector, placed his daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne. But within 9 days, the supporters of Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, had rallied. Catherine of Aragon had been a well-loved figure, and the nation as a whole was reluctant to see her daughter denied the crown that was rightfully hers. Although she was a Catholic, they proclaimed her their queen, and her rivals were swiftly imprisoned and executed. Mary was devoutly religious, and her driving aim was to return her country to the Catholic faith, from which her father and latterly her young brother Edward had severed it. On coming to the throne in 1553, she set the Counter-Reformation in motion, and her reign was characterized by the persecution of many Protestant martyrs who were burned at the stake. Mary wanted to strengthen England's ties with Catholicism by forming a match with Philip of Spain. The marriage was intensely unpopular, and Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion in protest. After his defeat, Mary reigned for 5 inflammatory years, during which time she was unable to fulfill her dearest wish and bear her husband Philip a child, so that when she died in 1558, her sister Elizabeth ascended the throne. Since the Catholics outlawed divorce and would therefore question the legality of the marriage between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and by implication her own legitimacy, Elizabeth I undid the work of her half-sister and returned England to the Protestant faith. She was a consummate politician, and her foreign policy hinged on the device of appearing to offer marriage to various powerful foreign princes and then withholding it. She became known as the Virgin Queen when she wasn't tantalizing foreign princes with the possibility of marriage. Elizabeth was giving financial and military aid to Protestants on the continent, particularly those in Holland who were intent on throwing off the yoke of the Spanish Catholics who ruled them. This behavior incensed her brother-in-law, King Philip of Spain, and in 1588 he dispatched an armada of 130 massive ships to invade England. Elizabeth went to Tilbury, where her own navy was preparing itself for battle. Under the leadership of Lord Howard of Effingham, who was aided by Francis Drake, the Spanish Armada, although far superior in strength, was defeated, and the threat from the Catholics abroad was greatly reduced. At home, they remained a menace to Elizabeth and found their focus in Mary, Queen of Scots. Having abdicated the throne of Protestant Scotland, Mary fled to England and threw herself on the mercy of her cousin. Elizabeth kept her in prison for 19 years, where she became a figurehead for oppressed Catholics who plotted in secret to secure the English throne for the Scottish Queen. One such plot, instigated by Anthony Barrington, was discovered, and Elizabeth took the opportunity to execute her great rival. The Elizabethan era has become known as a golden age, one of discovery and enlightenment. It was a period unparalleled in English literature. As well as Shakespeare, geniuses like Christopher Marlowe, Francis Bacon, Ben Jonson, and Edmund Spenser were producing the best of their work. Voyages of discovery were made abroad, and England began to lay the foundations of what was later to become her empire, claiming new territories such as Virginia in North America, named after Gloriana, the Virgin Queen.